Have you ever gotten overwhelmed by all your 401k investment options? I know that many people come to us and are worried that they're not in the right allocation and they don't know what the different options mean. Well, the good news is today we're going to be going over that and we're going to be breaking down different investment options in your 401k, specifically regarding target date funds. I've got Teresa Arago with me today from our Conway office. And we're going to take a deep dive into all the different little nuances of your 401k investment options. So, Teresa, what are some of the common 401k options and what do they mean?
Well, I'm going to share a story that I love to share mostly because it's not about me, but it's making fun of one of our advisors. When you talk about this concept of feeling overwhelmed with your investment options, I remember a story that Scott told us a long time ago about being in a high yield fund in his 20s. Because he thought everybody wants high yield. Of course I want to be in a high yield fund. Well, spoiler alert, that's a bond fund. They're not made to grow. They're made to stabilize. And so he was very frustrated with his investment, his returns and all of that for a period of time before he realized that he was in the wrong type of fund. So understand that even us advisors can get it wrong. Earlier in my life, I didn't know the things I know now. So there's no shame in taking some time to educate yourself. But that's a big part of why we're so passionate about teaching this. And there's really 4 categories when we're talking about an investment inside of a 401k, kind of broad categories. All of the funds that are in there are going to fit in one of these things. So the first one would be fixed income. That's our jargon word, but let's talk about what that really is. Bonds. Bonds are loans. So a company wants to be able to get some money to use to do whatever within their company. They'll issue a loan, and you can buy those and they'll pay interest. So they're not made to be huge performers. They're made to be stabilizers. And normally they work that way. I will say when interest rates are going wonky, they can get a little ugly, but that's what they're there for. What to look for on your investment list to know if it's a bond would be words like yield, obviously bond, or fixed. Usually those are going to be things. Your money market is just going to be an interest one. So if you see like government money market, those will be some things to clue you in on that. So there's our fixed income funds. Alec, why don't you talk about our equity income blended funds?
Yes, with our equity income blended, that's going to have a little bit of mix of both. It's going to have the equity, so it'll have the growth aspect of the investment, but you're also going to have the income side, so a little bit more conservative. So it's not full growth, it's not full conservative, it's whatever allocation that they have. Some will just have 1 or 2 options. Some you can get as specific as 80% equities, 20% bonds to maybe 50-50 and maybe more bonds than more equity. It really just depends on your employer and what options they give you, but there's typically a lot of flexibility with those equity and income blended funds.
So what are the things to look for to know if you've got a blended fund like this?
Yeah, it'll say it's a blended fund or a balanced fund. Usually it'll say some 80 or 20, and what that means is 80% of usually equity, 20% bonds, or it could be a 60-40, 60% equity, 40% bonds. And there's usually that blend or balance somewhere in that.
In the titling, right? So that'll give you that one. And something to know is that the first number is always going to be the equity exposure. When you see 2 numbers like that, the first number is going to be your stock side. The second side number is going to be your bond side, just to help people understand what you're reading. The other category would be equity funds. So again, jargon word, equity, stocks. These are little bitty pieces of ownership in companies. These are the ones that you hope will grow. They're meant to grow. They don't always do that. They can get volatile, but those are usually going to be labeled by what they track. So it might say large cap or mid cap or small cap. Those are the sizes of the companies that are in there. All of these have what's called a prospectus. It's the guardrails around what that investment advisor or the manager can purchase inside of that. So if you see one that says technology, then it's likely going to be all technology. There are some funds around that are like the S&P 500. Understand you can't just buy the S&P 500, but what they're doing is they're tracking who's included and they're buying a little bit of all those companies. But you get more diversification because they can buy within reason a lot of different things, or you can get diversification. Some can be pretty nuanced. So we've got those fixed income looking for the words like bonds or interest, dividend. Those are more fixed, you've got your equity income blends, you've got your equities, and then what we're really here to talk about today, which is the target date funds. And the way you'll identify those, they have a bunch of fun names because, in our industry, we love to make fun names up. But usually they'll have a year at the end. And that year designates, technically, based on how they're made, when you would be retiring. But we would argue that maybe that's not the year you need to pick. So let's talk about that a little more.
Yeah, so with target date funds, it really just depends on how old you are and when you're going to retire for the date. Sometimes if you're going to retire in 2035 and it's 2025 today, it may not be the best option to choose that 2035 fund. And the reason for that is the way that they pick the allocations in those. If I'm choosing a target date fund that's 10 years away, it's going to be way more conservative than something 40 years away, like a 2065. It works like you're landing an airplane where the ones that are further out, the airplane is higher up and it's more equity and it's a lot less bonds. But the closer we get to landing to that retirement, it's going to get a lot more bond exposure. So if I'm in 2025 and I want to retire in 40 years in 2065, that's going to be a lot of equity if I choose that 2065 one. But as I get closer to 2065, it's going to start shifting to be more equity, more fixed income, or more fixed income, less equity. So it really just depends when you're going to retire and what kind of growth you want to see. If there's someone who's 55 and they're going to retire in 2035, they can still choose different target dates other than that 2035. They're not bound to choose the 2035. Your funds won't get locked up to where if you choose a 2065, you can't pull money out at when it's 2035. You have access whenever. It's just, what is the allocation and what is the growth like?
And before we got started today, you were talking about this concept because we have some people that will come in and they'll go, well, when I retire, I just need to get more conservative. I need to be super conservative because I can't afford to take any losses. And we always talk about how it's not a destination. It's just kind of like a yield sign. And then we still have to move forward. But you were talking about being on a long trip. And that was I feel like a great analogy for how these work and why maybe taking an earlier one may not make sense depending on your circumstances. Explain that for our listeners, what you were talking about earlier. I think it was a great analogy.
Yeah, so if I'm taking a 12-hour road trip and I'm 11 hours in, so I'm almost done with the trip, I don't want to start slowing down there. I have a whole nother hour to go. And how that relates to target date funds is I may be 10 years out from retirement and I could choose that 2035 fund that's not speed. It's a lot more slowed down. It's a lot more fixed income. But then I'm slowing down my growth for 10 full years before I retire when you can get a lot of growth. So keep your foot on the gas and keep choosing that further out target date for that last stretch of your accumulation phase until you get to retirement, because you can catch a lot of growth. You don't need to slow down too early or it could really cause you to not take advantage of the market.
Yeah, and I think, there are a lot of, even in the later funds, it is well diversified typically. So it's not like you have zero bond exposure, even in a target fund that's a little bit further out. But at about the 15 mark is where that bond exposure really amps up. So if you are within 15 years of the target fund you've chosen, pay attention to that bond exposure and talk with your advisor to see if it makes sense to shift out to keep that bond exposure managed. There are other ways to deal with that, having some, sidelined money. I've had clients before that we were getting close. They didn't have the option of moving it out and preparing for retirement. We just moved their first year's income into something more conservative and left the rest to continue growing. So it's all about your strategy and your plan when it comes down to it. But if you don't have an advisor in your life and you're trying to figure out what to do, if your goal is to keep those equities high, make sure you're really chasing some growth, then I always tell people, pick the latest one. What's the last year they offer? And by the way, you can just change it later. You can keep shifting that out and we call it kicking the can down the road, right? You can keep shifting it. But let's talk about who we feel like is the best candidate, though, for a target date fund, because there are some people that we're like, you don't need a target date fund. But there are some that we will encourage them. Even if we could give them an allocation, we'll go, hey, listen, let's look at these. Let's talk about that person.
Yeah, I think it can be overwhelming for some people to go in there and have to choose each individual stock and each individual like percentage of equities to fixed income, and it can just seem overwhelming. But with target date fund, you're just choosing a date and letting somebody do that for you. So I think for people who maybe don't have as much experience in the market, aren't as comfortable with choosing those portfolio allocations, it's a lot easier to just choose a date, forget about it, and I think it's easy to kind of sit it or choose that date and let that allocation get chosen for you.
Yeah, and I think for those that I have some clients who they hardly look at their portfolio. They don't panic. They don't, feel like they have to micromanage it. And then I have other clients that would absolutely make themselves crazy. They would check it out. They're checking their balance every day. And my 401k is now a 201k because we had a minor setback in the market. If you find that you tend to do that, to obsess, maybe using a target date fund would allow you to take some of that pressure off of yourself, to not feel like you have to watch it so carefully. Because if you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and you're not planning to retire for a while, staying the course, staying invested is way more important than trying to find some magic allocation, which, by the way, there's not one. There's not going to be anything that keeps you from being exposed to risk if you're investing. So instead of stressing about that, manage it. Do what you can by being well diversified. Make sure you're talking with your advisor, but don't let yourself panic over that if you've got these tools to be able to stay well diversified without having to constantly monitor it. And then, what's the con? We kind of already alluded to this, but you do still have to watch it. You still have to make sure that you're not choosing one that is more conservative than you need. Or on the flip side, if you're nearing retirement, you may not need to be in the very last one. You might need to be in one of those that's kind of in the middle that has a little bit more bond exposure, but it all depends on your plan.
Well, regardless of what you're going to do, I think it's just key to get into your employer plan, especially if there's a match, because that's a free return right there. If they're doing a certain percentage of your salary, that's an automatic 100% return off the bat. So getting into that employer plan, finding out if they actually have an employer plan is also really important. But if they do, get into it, figure out what the match is, because it's free money. It builds a good habit of saving money. And it's easy to save it because it just comes out of your paycheck. It's getting deducted. It never hits your bank account, and it's going into a retirement fund. And then you can go in there, choose whatever fund fits your lifestyle or fits your timeline for retirement. And yeah, I think just getting your foot in the door and getting started is the best first step to take.
And I think too, if you're looking for ways to amp up your savings, let's say you've been in the employer plan and you've been successfully putting in the match, have you considered setting an automatic increase for every year? A lot of 401ks have that set up where you can go in there and say, hey, every year I want my contribution to increase by 1%, 2%. The younger you are, the more impactful that's going to be. But no matter your age, no matter whether you're, on his end or mine, getting started and increasing that consistently will really help you make progress towards your goals. We're going to be talking about this concept of trying to get to your first $1 million here soon in one of our episodes. I'd love for you to catch that. But it really has always been encouraging to me that the clients that come in that are ready, the most ready, tend to be people who had an average Joe kind of job. So don't feel like you have to be in some freakishly high-paying job to make progress on your goals. Just get started and stay the course.
All right. Well, that brings us to our final 2 cents. I'll go ahead and go first. My 2 cents are just investment products can be tricky. They can be complicated, but they're not inherently good or bad either. It just depends if you're in the right thing for you. And I think it's good to understand them if you're using them. You need to believe that what you're doing is the right thing. So reaching out, listening to podcasts like this, reaching out to us or friends or family who maybe know a little bit more is really important. You need to believe what you're doing in, have a good understanding in it, and that's how you're going to stick with it.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's for the bad markets. Like if you have a strategy and you believe in your strategy, then it'll help you not make a rash decision during a market downturn, because those tend to be short-lived. I can't guarantee they're going to be, but if you just stay the course, you're going to be better off. And if you'd like some help on that journey to financial independence, you can go to our website, getreadyforthefuture.com/keys to download 6 keys to financial independence. You can do that from our website, or you can text KEYS to 501-381-5228.
Well, thank you for joining us today on Talking Sense. We hope that we gave you some actionable steps to take towards your future. If you liked what you heard, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, or anywhere where you find your podcasts. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we're looking forward to seeing you next time on Talking Sense.
Thanks for listening to Talking Sense. And if you like what you hear, make sure and subscribe to the podcast to get all the newest episodes. The Jim Wealth team is available to you 24/7 at info@getreadyforthefuture.com or by calling our offices at 866-653-PLAN. That's 866-653-7526. And while we like to have fun here, we're also financial advisors, and that means disclosures. You should personally consult a financial advisor before making any investment, and no strategy can assure success. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advice offered through Independent Advisor Alliance. Independent Advisor Alliance and Jim Wealth Financial Advisors are separate entities from LPL Financial.